Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. For years, they were described as Hispanic, then as Latinos. With 17% of the nation's population, they comprise its largest minority group. Now, some of its members are choosing to identify as Latinx. Why? Who qualifies as Latinx? And how will the way its members choose to identify themselves going forward affect the balance of power in this country? In his new book, Latinx, The New Force in American Politics and Culture, Ed Morales, journalist and lecturer at the CUNY Graduate Center, tries to answer these questions. His book is published by Verso Books. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Cheryl.
Ed, first of all, where did the term Latinx come from and why?
Well, there are a lot of origin stories having to do with Latinx. The main pickup in its use occurred in the middle of last decade, but it goes back to the use of X by several Mexican-American writers as far back as the 1970s and mostly in the 1990s by Chicana feminists who used the X to allude to the use of X among indigenous people in Mexico, which was a letter that they recognized better to pronounce Spanish words because of the Spanish colonization. But Latinx really came up among some of my students at a seminar I teach at Columbia at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, where they began to use the term really after many years. I've been teaching this seminar, and there was more students who preferred not to identify with the broader term of Hispanic or Latino. They would rather identify with their individual national groups. Then I started to see more students wanting to use Latinx, and it was explained to me that the X was a way to include non-binary people and by extension LGBTQIA people, because Spanish is a gendered language in which all nouns are masculine or feminine. And so to avoid that kind of bias in the language, some students started to use the word X, and it became really synonymous with LGBTQ or queer inclusivity. When I chose a title for my book, I did it because I thought it was a forward-thinking term, and I thought that there was a parallel between the idea of a spectrum of identity that non-binary people had and the one that I had been thinking about for years that Latinos do. My book, Latinx, is really a book about Latino racial identity. And so that's why I chose it, because I saw this parallel between the black and white race binary sort of being challenged and the male-female binary.
I think a lot of Americans regard Latinos, I'm going to use the term Latinos probably, as belonging to an ethnic group, not Asian, not white, not black, but falling somewhere in between, perhaps brown or off-white, who also come from a Spanish-speaking culture. And you make the case in your book that Latinos, as a group, they're more complicated than just being off-white. Tell me about that. A lot more complicated, in fact.
Yeah, off-white is a little bit of it doesn't really describe the scope of the Latinx experience. However, it's very centered, unfortunately, in many representations of what we call Latinidad, which is the state of Latinos in the United States. And that's one of the political arguments that is going on now. There are sociologists who have referred to Latinos or Hispanics as an ethno-racial group, which means that there are things about Latinos that are best measured by studying it as an ethnic group, but there are definitely levels of racism that Latinos face, which make them a racial group as well. A lot of times the use of languages other than English racializes Latinos. And a lot of times the appearance of Latinos, which is, I don't know, some people think of as brown, can cause Latinos to be questioned in terms of their citizenship. Also, the US used justifications of racial inferiority to justify some of their treatment of Mexicans after the Mexican War and of Puerto Ricans, which is one of the main reasons why Puerto Rico is not a state, because Puerto Ricans were seen, because of their racial background, as unfit to participate in US democracy.
So what qualifies one as Latino? What do all Latinos have in common?
Well, a lot of times, look, these sorts of labels and identifications have it's a sort of a two-way street. They can be imposed by government bureaucracy or by people who have racist preconceptions about what you might be. And then there's also identity that people choose. So I think that, I wrote my book for people who choose to identify as racially different or not belonging to the American project of whiteness. Latinos, there are many people who can qualify as Latino because maybe they have a Hispanic surname and their their roots are in Latin America. But a lot of those people choose no longer to identify as Latino, which is one of the reasons why it can be misleading to say that Latinos are 17% or the largest group, because many of them don't really identify with racial difference, and many Latinos are Black and living virtually African-American lives. So in a sense, it's an inaccurate measurement.
But they come from one of 20 different countries, or, originally.
Yeah.
There's a common original language, which is Spanish. And you also mentioned that they share a history of occupation by and domination by white Europeans.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that when we use the word America to describe the United States, it has the effect of obscuring the rest of the American continents, or the West, this hemisphere that we live in, which was, conquered or settled in a very parallel way. It was just it was actually more than two, but the two main colonizers were English and Spanish. Then there's also Portuguese, and then there are various islands that were colonized by the French and the Dutch, etc. So yes, Latino represents an identity of the Americas that has long been overlooked.
Because of the notorious one-drop rule, African Americans who run the gamut in skin color, facial features, and hair texture tend to identify themselves as Black and sort of see the world in sort of Black-white terms. But you're right, interestingly enough, that Latinos tend to view race as a choice. Well, as we know, some identify as white, others as Black, others as mixed race. And overall, there seems to be less cohesiveness among Latinos than there is among African Americans. Do you agree? And does that put them at some kind of advantage or disadvantage?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it puts Latinos at a disadvantage when it comes to US politics, because too often they don't have a shared agenda. What you were saying about the one-drop rule, maybe in an oversimplistic way, if you reverse the one-drop rule, you get the idea of what it's like in Latin America, where often people with any European ancestry were spared the distinction of being in the category of African descended people, and were granted what some people call a degree of honorary whiteness. And this confuses a lot of Latinos when they come to the United States, who, even though they don't really appear to be white the way that the US views whiteness, they feel that they have been granted some form of honorary whiteness from their experience in Latin America, and they can become confused that they are people of color or marginalized. And that's another reason why there's a lack of cohesion. There's no ambiguity about being racially discriminated against among African Americans. And I think that gives African Americans a lot of political power.
Even though One could argue that Latinos have surpassed African Americans in numbers and in percentages of the population. They seem to lack, I mean, as you suggest, the political clout as a group that African Americans have. I think there's a smaller percentage of Latinos in Congress than there are Blacks. No Latino has come close to occupying the White House. What kind of political clout do they have?
I think that Latinos have a strong regional power in places where they are, have a higher percentage of the population, like places like California, Texas, and the Southwest, and also South Florida to an extent. But that power usually has to do with the local interests of the particular Latin American national group that is predominant. Like for instance, Mexican Americans can advance their agenda through the many Mexican American elected officials in California. And as we know, the Cuban American bloc in South Florida has had an unusually disproportionate effect on national elections because of the remnants of Cold War policy towards Cuba. So, on a local level, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in New York City, have succeeded in, electing a lot of elected officials that can represent their interests, but there isn't a national cohesion. There hasn't even really been close to one. There's an interesting couple of books that came out last year about Latinos in politics that talked about these summits that occurred in the 1970s between like the not the mayor, but the U.S. Representative Herman Badillo. I don't even remember, if you remember him, who was borough president of the Bronx, and these Mexican American politicians from Los Angeles, where they tried to develop a national Latino agenda. And it was actually kind of interesting and progressive, included talking about reforming policy towards Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the border. But it was undermined by a lot of disagreements and lack of cohesion, and the fact that Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time, didn't really feel that it was enough of a priority.
Is one of the reasons Latinos lack this kind of political cohesiveness because they tend to identify in terms of the nation, their national identity. We're Puerto Rican, we're Cuban, we're Mexican, we're Dominican, as opposed to we're Latino.
Yes, that's a big part of the problem, and these national identities are strong for good reasons and also very ordinary reasons. Like national pride can also boil down to rooting for your national soccer team or things like that, or athletes, or the kind of music that you listen to, or the kind of food that you prefer. But at the same time, there has been, the idea of the Latino national identity is not completely fabricated. There have been a lot of Latinos who have tried to work together, particularly in places like New York, which is the most diverse Latino city in the country, because no one has really more than 20 or 25% of the population. Right now, it's Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and Dominicans who are right around between 17 and 21%. So there's historically been a lot of cooperation between different Latino groups in New York. And that's one place where it kind of works, but on a national level, it doesn't work as well.
You also note that there is, really like Asian Americans, has been a tendency to regard Latinos as forever foreigners, forever unassimilated, a widespread belief that they don't master the English language, even though this is not true.
Yeah, absolutely. Most studies show that by the third generation, Hispanics or Latinos are fluent in English and actually don't really speak Spanish as much as their ancestors or predecessors. And yeah, that forever foreigner thing has always been a problem for Latinos. But part of it is because Latinos themselves choose to retain aspects of their original culture, unlike a lot of European immigrants. And the proximity to Latin America allows for continuing migration to kind of restock, the sense of the culture. People continually learn to be Puerto Rican and Dominican from new immigrants, people who are a little out of touch with it. And they can travel easily back and forth. So it's not like Europe where it's a long journey to go back and you pretty much leave it all behind. Asians have their own difficulty because they actually speak a number of really different and sometimes highly varied languages. So it's amazing actually that Asians do manage to unite a lot of times to form a political agenda. But I think that a lot of that is based on the same reason why Latinos should be united, and that's anti-Asian discrimination. It's really a strong, compelling reason for people to organize in larger groups and use a kind of strategic essentialism so they can find things in common.
I personally attest to the fact that African Americans talk about race all the time when they're together. You write, however, that Latinos don't talk much about race among themselves, that they in fact avoid talking about it. What's that about?
Well, that has a lot to do with the way that Latin Americans are socialized in Latin America because of these ideologies that I refer to as mestizaje ideologies. Mestizaje is a word that describes mixture in general or racial mixture. And so what happened was with the explosion of the race science that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was an attempt to scientifically justify the superiority of white Europeans. The leaders of Latin America found that this was a problem for them because it was clear that white people in Latin America were a much smaller minority than they were in the United States and in European countries. So they decided to devise this ideology that celebrated the mixture of races while having sort of this hidden agenda of continuing to center European values and justify a sort of a muted white supremacy. So because of that, many people in Latin America, the rhetoric there is, there's no racism because we're all mixed, so how can we be racist? Which is similar to people who say, well, I'm married to an African American, and how can I be racist when they can still obviously be racist? And that has the effect of many Latin Americans being socialized to believe that it's impossible for them to be racist because they're mixed, and they bring that attitude also to the US. In some ways, there is a lot of dealing with race in Latin American families because we have many different races within our own families. Some families do it better than others, but sometimes there's really kind of an overt racism that happens even within families that a lot of my students complain about being the darker one in the family, right, and being more discriminated against.
And I remember, when I was visiting Cuba, even though the rhetoric is there's no racial discrimination here, the revolution got rid of that, and now we're just all Cubans. But if you notice who has the coveted jobs in the tourist industry, they're all the light-skinned Cubans, and the people who are selling tchotchkes in the park are the dark-skinned, are the dark-skinned Cubans. Several years ago, when the US Census Bureau announced that by the year 2050, Caucasians would no longer be in the majority, and Latinos would comprise 25% of the US population. This seemed to press a panic button in the mainstream press. This was a story on the cover of, it was a lead story in many publications. What's the fear? And what are the implications of this demographic change?
Well, I think that, it's clear that in the US, there's a feeling of normalcy that is constructed around, the centering of whiteness or white European values. And so anytime that is questioned by, the demographic reality that there will be more people of color than white people in the US population, that seems to cause some uneasiness, without being too political about it. I mean, the actions that created the United States in the colonization period were have left a long historical memory of in people who whose ancestors, and obviously we can't count. It's not the same for European immigrants that came within the last 50 years, but the legacy of settler colonialism, which meant the isolating and displacement of Native Americans, and obviously the enslavement of African descended people until the middle of the 19th century, has an underlying function in American society that can set off alarm bells.
Even though, as you point out, Latinos from the different national groups have not coalesced strongly as a bonded group, the title of your book suggests that Latinos are a growing force in American politics and culture. You suggest that they may coalesce, that they're going to have more political power. How so? How do you see that happening?
Well, there are more than ever, Latino elected officials are, increasing all around the country. There's a move to make sure that Latinos are are being represented at higher levels of power. You saw it happen when Kamala Harris was replaced as her senator seat was replaced in California by a Mexican American. You have figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who in many ways has revolutionized Democratic party politics, and so not necessarily by playing to Latino interests. But one thing that I've written about AOC is that I think she represents a new kind of politician that represents an intersectional platform in which she is unafraid of announcing that she is a feminist. She's Puerto Rican. She's bilingual. She's a New Yorker, and all of these identities all come together, and the informal sociological take on millennials is that is their sensibility anyway. So it's not the first time that it's happened that sort of diverse political or cultural outlook that is associated with Latinos is also mapped on to how we understand millennials. But I do think that multiple positionality, as it were, that AOC and other Latinos might represent, I think could be a part of Latinos becoming a more powerful force in the future, if not necessarily through overtly representing Latino interests.
You also say that one of the keys to how powerful they're having an impact, strong impact on what happens in this country depends on whether they claim their Blackness. What do you mean by that? We have about 2 minutes left.
Well, obviously not all Latinos have African ascendancy, but many more of us do than are comfortable talking about. And I think that much of the progress that Latinos have made politically and culturally in this country is by recognizing their Blackness and recognizing their affinity with African American people, and expanding their appreciation or mapping of themselves, to embrace and center Blackness. I think that one of the most important conversations that's going on in the Latinx community right now is confronting our own racism and allowing so many young voices, scholars and journalists who are speaking out strongly about this. And I think it can only have a positive effect.
Well, one thing I learned from your book, certainly Latinx people are a rich mixture of many, many things. And what kind of impact they're going to have on the country going forward is complicated. And I think you were able to sketch out that what those complications are in your book. So anyone who's interested in the subject, I think it's will learn a lot from it. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Ed Morales, author of Latinx, The New Force in American Politics and Culture, for joining me today. The book is published by Verso Books. Also, to learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at One2One CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and One2One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.